Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for a tale where the dead do not rest, where love is a lie, and where the face in the mirror might not be your own. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Nigeria, into a home where the past has clawed its way back from the grave and it is hungry. This is The Call from Momo's Grave. Viewer discretion advised. This story contains psychological terror, betrayal from beyond the grave, a twist that will rewrite reality, and one question: are you sure you're alone right now? Welcome to Storytime Africa. Gather round, listeners. Tonight's tale will freeze your blood, twist your mind, and leave you questioning every shadow in your room. So hit like, tap share, and whatever you do, don't answer that phone call after midnight. Prepare yourselves for a story so dark, so twisted, it will claw its way into your dreams and stay there. The Call from Momo's Grave isn't just a tale, it's an experience. A journey into betrayal, buried sins, and a love that was never real. Emeka's mother has been dead for 6 months when the phone calls begin, her voice, weak but unmistakable, warning him about his new wife, Adana. At first, he dismisses it as grief playing tricks on his mind. But when he uncovers a decades-old family secret, he realizes his wife is not who she claims to be. The deeper he digs, the more horrifying the truth becomes, until he questions his own sanity, his past, and even his own existence. This is a story of betrayal, buried sins, and a love that was never real. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. Emeka groaned, rolling over in bed. Beside him, Adana slept peacefully, her breathing slow and steady. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the bedside clock. He fumbled for his phone on the nightstand, blinking against the brightness of the screen. Unknown number. His brows knitted. Who the hell calls at this hour? He hesitated before answering, irritation sharp in his voice. Hello. Silence. A deep, hollow silence that sent a shiver down his spine. Then, Emeka, my son. The blood in his veins turned to ice. That voice. Weak, raspy, but unmistakable. Mama. A sharp breath caught in his throat. His fingers clenched the phone as his pulse roared in his ears. It couldn't be. Mama was gone. Buried 6 months ago. The line crackled, as if the voice had been swallowed by static, then. Click. The call disconnected. Emeka sat frozen, heart hammering against his ribs. His gaze darted to the phone screen, his breath shallow. He swiped to check the call log. Nothing. The call wasn't there. His mouth went dry. He checked again, scrolling frantically. No record. No number. No trace of the call. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe he was still dreaming. But the chill crawling up his spine told him otherwise. Emeka. He flinched. Adana's drowsy voice barely cut through the fog of his thoughts. He turned to her. She was stirring, peering at him with sleepy concern. What's wrong? She mumbled. Nothing, he lied, forcing his voice to steady. Just a weird dream. She hummed sleepily, already drifting back to unconsciousness. He watched her for a moment, grounding himself in her presence. His heartbeat slowed, but his mind refused to settle. He needed air. Sliding out of bed, he moved carefully to avoid waking Adana. The wooden floor was cold beneath his feet as he stepped into the hallway. The darkness pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. He made his way to the living room and switched on the lamp. A soft yellow glow flickered to life, chasing away some of the unease curling in his gut. He sank onto the couch, phone still clutched in his hand. The silence of the apartment stretched around him, too deep, too unnatural. Momo's voice echoed in his mind. My son. A memory surfaced, one he hadn't let himself dwell on for months. The last time he had seen her. She was in that hospital bed, frail and tired, her once bright eyes dimming. The scent of antiseptic and sickness clung to the air. He had held her hand, promising he'd be back soon. He hadn't known it would be the last time. Guilt twisted in his chest. A creak. Emika's head snapped up. The noise came from the kitchen. His pulse spiked as he strained to listen. The apartment was supposed to be empty. He hadn't heard Adana get up. Another creak. Closer this time. He slowly rose to his feet, muscles tensing. The air had changed, thicker, heavier, laced with something he couldn't name. A whisper of movement near the doorway. He turned sharply, breath caught in his throat. The kitchen was dark. Empty. Or so it seemed. He took a step forward, each movement slow, calculated. His phone screen reflected faintly off the polished floor, a small beacon in the dim room. He reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered once, twice before plunging the room back into darkness. Then he heard it. A sigh. Soft, almost sorrowful. Right behind him. A jolt of pure fear shot through him as he spun around, phone raised like a shield. Nothing. The air felt different now, less suffocating but still charged, like static before a storm. His skin prickled as he took a shaky breath. It had to be his imagination. The stress. The exhaustion. The late hour. Yet, deep down, he knew better. Momo's voice had been real. And something was trying to reach him. His hands trembled as he backed away from the kitchen, every instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. He needed answers. But he wasn't sure he wanted them. Adana was everything a man could want: beautiful, intelligent, kind. She had come into Emika's life like a blessing, just months after his mother's death, filling the void with her warmth. Her laughter was like a melody that soothed his grief, her touch a balm on his weary heart. Everyone said he was lucky to have found a woman like her. But lately, little things bothered him. The way she sometimes hummed the lullaby his mother used to sing. The way she avoided his mother's relatives, claiming they didn't like her. The way she flinched whenever someone mentioned fire. And now, the call. It had come the night before, just as they were settling into bed. Adana had gone to take a shower when Emika's phone vibrated on the nightstand. He frowned. It was late. Who would be calling? A private number. Hesitating, he answered. Hello. A breath on the other end. Then, a whisper. She's not who she says she is. Emika sat up straight. Who is this? Silence. Then the line went dead. His pulse hammered in his ears. He glanced toward the bathroom, where the faint sound of running water masked his ragged breathing. His fingers tightened around the phone as he stared at the screen. Who would say such a thing? And why? Adana stepped out of the bathroom moments later, wrapped in a towel, her damp curls cascading over her shoulders. She flashed him a smile. Everything okay? Forcing his expression into neutrality, he nodded. Yeah. Just work. She watched him for a bit longer than necessary before walking to her side of the bed. He barely slept that night. You've been distracted lately, Adana said over breakfast, her dark eyes studying him over the rim of her teacup. Emika forced himself to meet her gaze, to push down the unease creeping into his chest. Just work stress, he lied. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. You know you can tell me anything, right? He forced a smile. of course. But the doubt had rooted itself deep, impossible to ignore. And it only grew as the days passed. The following week, Emeka left work early. He had told himself he wouldn't snoop, that he was being paranoid. But something inside him wouldn't let go of the nagging feeling. He needed answers. Adana was out running errands. He had at least an hour. He started with her wardrobe. Nothing unusual, her neatly folded clothes, the faint scent of her perfume. Then the bedside drawer. Books, some old letters from her sister. A small jewelry box. And then, tucked beneath a stack of documents, an old photograph. He pulled it out carefully. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded. It was a picture of Adana. Younger. Happier. Standing in front of a house he didn't recognize. Beside her was an older woman. Not her mother. Someone else. His hands tightened around the paper. A fire had once ravaged his mother's childhood home. He had grown up hearing the story of how his grandmother had perished in the flames, how his mother had barely escaped. The tragedy had haunted their family for years. And yet, the woman in the photograph bore an eerie resemblance to the only existing picture of his grandmother. His heart pounded. What did this mean? A creak at the front door sent panic surging through him. Quickly, he shoved the photograph back into the drawer and closed it. Emeka. Adana's voice drifted from the hallway. He took a deep breath, willing his pulse to slow. I'm here. She appeared in the doorway, a grocery bag in hand, her expression unreadable. You're home early. He shrugged. Felt like taking the rest of the day off. She studied him for a moment before smiling. That's good. You worked too hard. He nodded, but he could still feel the weight of the photograph burning in his mind. She was hiding something. And he was going to find out what. 3 nights later, Emeka woke to the sound of whispering. The familiar quiet of the night had been shattered by low voices coming from the other side of the room. At first, he thought it might just be a figment of his imagination, the product of a restless mind. But then he heard it again. Adana wasn't in bed beside him. She was somewhere in the house, her voice barely audible, but unmistakably sharp with tension. He sat up, heart racing. What was she up to? He crept toward the bedroom door, careful not to make a sound. As he pressed his ear against the cool wood, he could just make out her words, but only just. Her voice, hushed but urgent. He's starting to suspect. A pause. Then. He still doesn't know I'm your sister. Emeka's breath caught in his throat. Sister. The words seemed to freeze around him as confusion set in. His mind scrambled, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. His mother had no siblings, at least, that's what he'd been told his whole life. And yet, here was Adana, speaking of a hidden truth, a secret she had clearly kept from him. Was his entire life a lie? He barely noticed his fingers trembling as he backed away from the door. Thoughts spun wildly in his head. The implications of what she had just revealed were too big to process in a moment like this. And what did she mean by, he still doesn't know? Who was he? The pieces of the puzzle, once so carefully arranged in his mind, were now scattered across the floor, impossible to fit together. At this point in the story, you might be wondering, what is the secret? Who is Adana really? Drop a comment below with your theories, and don't forget to like if you're enjoying the suspense. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Emeka's heart pounded in his chest as he tiptoed down the hallway, barely able to see in the dark. He felt as though he were chasing shadows, trying to piece together fragments of a truth that seemed more elusive the closer he got to it. The house was eerily silent now, save for the occasional creak of floorboards beneath his feet. His mind was racing. His thoughts were like a storm, swirling around his mind, each one more frantic than the last. Was this all some kind of twisted game? And what role did his mother play in all of this? He reached the living room, where the soft glow of a lamp illuminated the corners of the room. Adana was standing by the window, looking out into the night. Her figure was outlined in the dim light, but there was something about her stance that sent a chill down his spine. She seemed distant, as if lost in thought. Emeka's pulse quickened. What was she planning? He hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. Adana, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't turn around. Adana, what's going on? What did you mean, sister? She froze. For a long moment, there was no response. Emeka stepped closer, his mind racing with questions, but his mouth remained shut, waiting for an answer. Finally, she turned, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. We need to talk, she said, her voice cold but trembling. What do you think is going on here? Why is Adana so hesitant to tell Emeka the full truth? Could she be hiding something even darker? Leave a comment with your guesses and make sure to hit that like button if you want to find out what happens next in this thrilling chapter. Adana's gaze flickered toward the door, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. Then, with a sigh, she gestured for Emeka to sit down. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Her usual confidence had vanished, replaced by an unsettling quiet. What you heard, she began, her voice shaky, wasn't supposed to happen this way. I wasn't supposed to tell you yet. Emeka's mind raced. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Tell me what, Adana? What's going on? Who is this person you're talking about? Why didn't you tell me before? She ran a hand through her hair, her eyes avoiding his. I didn't want to drag you into this, Emeka. But it's too late now. The truth is, it's complicated. Complicated. Emeka echoed, his voice rising. You've been lying to me, hiding things from me. How long has this been going on? She shook her head. It wasn't a lie. I didn't know how to explain it to you. And I didn't want you to be involved in something so dangerous. Emeka stared at her, his confusion deepening. Dangerous. Adana, what are you talking about? What are you involved in? Her eyes locked onto his, filled with a haunted expression. I'm not who you think I am, Emeka. I have my own past, one that's connected to someone you know very well. Someone who could destroy everything. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around Emeka. His mind was overwhelmed with 1,000 questions, but the most pressing one was, who? Adana's lips trembled, and she looked as if she might say something more. But then, the silence between them grew heavier, suffocating. I'll tell you everything, she said at last, her voice barely audible. But not yet. You're not ready to hear it. What's your take on Adana's secret? Could it be something bigger than Emeka can handle? If you're as curious as we are, hit like and leave your thoughts below. Trust me, this mystery is only getting started. Emeka stared at her, still trying to piece together the fragments of her cryptic words. The darkness of the night seemed to weigh heavier on him now, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He had always known that there were things about Adana's past that she kept hidden. But now, the truth felt closer, just out of reach. And in the silence of that moment, As Adana's eyes finally met his, Emeka realized that the only thing more terrifying than the unknown was the fear of what might happen if he pushed her for the truth. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Emeka made his way to his uncle's house. His throat swelled, and a pit formed in his stomach. He had never been close to his uncle, but today, something about the old man's cryptic demeanor made him uneasy. He had to know more about his mother's mysterious past. He couldn't shake the feeling that there were dark secrets buried in the family's history. As he entered the house, the scent of dust and aged wood filled the air, a reminder of the old man's affinity for preserving the past. His uncle, a frail figure with a shock of white hair, sat hunched over a large book, its leather cover cracked with age. When Emeka asked the question that had been gnawing at him for days, the old man froze, the air in the room thickening with an unspoken tension. Did Mama have a sister? Emeka watched as his uncle stiffened. His fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the pages of the book. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Why are you asking?" the old man finally muttered, his voice low, almost strained. Emeka swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just curious. I never knew anything about her." His uncle sighed heavily, the sound carrying a weight of old grief. Slowly, he closed the book in front of him and leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the room. There was one. Neoma. She died in a fire when they were children. The words hung in the air, like the smoke from a long-dead flame. Emeka's pulse quickened, and he leaned forward, trying to hold his composure. "How did it happen?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man's gaze shifted, locking onto Emeka's with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "No one knows, officially. They said it was an accident. But, some say your mother was there that night." A chill ran through Emeka's spine. His stomach twisted, the room seemed to darken, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. "What do you mean? Was she involved?" Emeka's voice cracked, the thought of his mother's connection to such a tragedy sending a wave of panic through him. His uncle leaned in, his eyes flickering with something dark, something not of this world. "That's what some people say, but they don't talk about it anymore. It's better if you forget about it." Emeka's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. There was something his uncle wasn't telling him. Something that went far deeper than just an old fire. His mother, Neoma, the fire, none of it felt like an accident. Suddenly, the old man's face contorted in pain. He gasped, clutching his chest as if struck by an unseen force. Emeka leapt to his feet, panic rising in his throat. "Uncle, are you okay? What's happening?" His uncle's voice came out in a strangled whisper. "Don't go digging into that past, Emeka. You don't understand, it's not safe. You..." Before he could finish, a loud crash echoed from the far corner of the room, the sound of a book hitting the floor. Emeka spun around, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. The book that his uncle had been reading was now lying open on the floor, its pages fluttering as though some invisible force had flipped through them. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Emeka felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. He stepped toward the book, his hand trembling as he picked it up. The pages were filled with strange symbols, symbols he had never seen before. As he skimmed through the pages, his eyes locked onto a particular passage that sent a shockwave through his body. The fire was not an accident. It was the awakening. The words echoed in his mind like a warning, their meaning as cryptic as they were chilling. He turned to his uncle, whose face was now pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "What does this mean?" Emeka demanded, his voice rising in panic. His uncle's eyes filled with terror. "You should never have come here, Emeka. You've awoken something that should have stayed buried. Just then, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. Emeka could see his breath misting in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and an icy finger seemed to brush against his spine. The room was no longer just cold, it was unnaturally cold, as if the very essence of the place had shifted. With a trembling hand, his uncle reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved amulet, placing it in Emeka's palm. "This will protect you," he whispered hoarsely. "But you must not speak of what you've seen here, or else you'll bring it back. You'll bring the fire." Emeka's heart raced as he clutched the amulet, its strange markings burning against his skin. What had his uncle just warned him about? What was he really protecting him from? Before Emeka could ask more, the old man collapsed back into his chair, his eyes glazed over, as if the life had been drained from him. The room grew darker, the shadows seeming to stretch unnaturally along the walls. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the corner of the room where the book had fallen. Emeka turned, his breath catching in his throat as the pages of the book flipped wildly, as if an invisible wind were forcing them. The ancient symbols glowed faintly, and Emeka felt a presence in the room, a presence that was not human. Before he could react, a voice, low and guttural, echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come, Emeka, you shouldn't have opened the book." Emeka's heart thundered in his chest as the room seemed to close in on him. He stumbled backward, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Was this a warning from the past? Was this the spirit of Neoma, caught in some eternal flame, seeking revenge? "Uncle!" Emeka shouted, but the old man remained lifeless, his eyes empty. With his paws hammering in his ears, Emeka made a split-second decision. He couldn't stay here any longer, not with whatever dark force was lurking in this room. He bolted for the door, but as his hand touched the doorknob, it twisted on its own, and the door slammed shut in his face. Panicked, Emeka spun around, the room now completely dark, save for the faint glow of the amulet in his hand. A cold laugh echoed from the shadows, sending a shiver down his spine. It's too late. Viewers, do you think Emeka has awakened something he wasn't meant to? What was his uncle hiding about the mysterious past? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Emeka's fingers trembled as he sifted through the dusty old family albums that had been tucked away in the back of the attic. He had always hated coming up here, the air too thick with secrets and memories best left undisturbed. But this time was different, this time, he had to know. The whispers in his family had only grown louder, and his encounter with Adana had sent a chill down his spine that refused to fade. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, each yellowed photo sparking a new memory, a new mystery, but nothing that could explain the unease in his bones. His mother, a young girl with an innocent smile, stared back at him from one photo. There, too, was the man who had once been his father, a face Emeka had long stopped recognizing. But it was the next photo that made his hand freeze mid-turn. There it was, a faded photograph, torn at the edges, as if it had been left in the sun too long. Emeka pulled it out, his breath catching in his throat. His mother, no older than 10, stood beside another girl, her arm draped over the girl's shoulder. They both smiled at the camera. The first thing that struck Emeka was the striking resemblance between the two girls. The same high cheekbones. The same sharp eyes. The same full lips, barely curved into a smile. But it wasn't just the features that sent shivers down his spine. There was something in the eyes of the girl standing next to his mother, a darkness that seemed to shimmer in the reflection of the flash, something unholy, a gaze too intense, too knowing for a child so young. He studied the photo further. At the bottom, in his grandmother's familiar handwriting, the words were scrawled in ink that had begun to fade with time. Neoma Ngozi, 1978. Neoma. He knew that name. It was the name of his mother's younger sister, the one who supposedly died as a child. A tragic accident, they'd all said. A story he had heard so many times, it had become as much a part of his family's narrative as anything else. But here, in this photograph, stood Neoma, not a ghost, but alive, smiling, as though nothing had ever happened. And beside her, his mother, Ngozi. Both young, both innocent. But the girl in the photograph looked exactly like Adana. Emeka's hands shook harder now. The air around him grew colder. A strange, almost suffocating pressure filled the room. He felt the unmistakable sensation that someone or something was watching him. The attic door creaked open behind him, and he snapped his head around. No one. The house was eerily still, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards under his feet. A thin shadow played across the far wall, just out of his sight, but when he turned, nothing was there. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the room, and the photograph fluttered from his hand, landing face up on the floor. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The girl in the photograph, Neoma, her eyes, were they always like that? There was something deeply unsettling about the intensity in her gaze. Something about the way the girl in the photograph seemed to be reaching out, as if trying to grab hold of him. This isn't possible. Emeka reached for the photograph slowly, hesitating as his fingers brushed its surface. His mind raced, he needed answers, needed to understand. But the photograph felt wrong now, its edges tingling against his fingertips. A low, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the air, something he couldn't quite make out. The voice, soft and distant, was both chilling and familiar. Emeka. He jerked his hand back, startled, his heart hammering in his chest. The house had never felt this alive, this oppressive. The shadows seemed darker, the air colder. And suddenly, he wasn't alone. The whisper grew louder, clearer, as if coming from right behind him. Emeka, you know who I am, don't you? He spun around, but the attic was empty. The window was shut, the faintest slivers of moonlight slicing through the cracks in the wooden walls. He reached for the photograph once again, his fingers trembling, and for the first time, he noticed something new, something that hadn't been there before. A faint, glowing mark at the top right corner of the photo, like a symbol that seemed to write in the dim light. It paused. A soft, rhythmic beat. His heart raced faster as he recognized the symbol. It was an ancient marking, something he had seen once, long ago. His grandmother had told him stories about it, stories of the old ways, the forgotten magic that still lingered in their bloodline. But those were just stories, right? Not anymore. His mind screamed, but his body moved on its own. He backed away from the photograph, but it was no use. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the very walls were closing in on him. And then the whispers came again, louder, more insistent, as if the photograph itself were alive, calling to him. Emeka, she's waiting. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed through the attic. Emeka's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted toward the corner where the sound had come from. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a tall, slender woman, her features obscured by the dim light. A chill ran down his spine. It was her, Adana. Her form was faint, translucent, as though she didn't belong in the world of the living. Yet, her presence felt as tangible as the cold floor beneath his feet. You found it. She whispered, her voice eerily familiar, yet laced with something ancient, something wrong. You found the truth. The photograph in his hand felt like it was burning now, and in an instant, his body was frozen, unable to move. The air grew thicker, the shadows twisted around him like long, clawed hands. Emeka, this story has been waiting for you. The truth has been buried for too long. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him in the suffocating silence. Adana's figure loomed closer, her eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity, her lips curling into a smile. "You should have never come here," she murmured. The photograph slipped from his fingers, drifting like a feather, landing on the floor once more. But this time, the faces of the two girls had changed, their eyes were wide and bloodshot, the smiles twisted into grotesque expressions. And as Emeka looked up, he realized it was no longer just Adana standing in front of him. The attic was full of them, hundreds of faces, each one staring at him, each one wearing the same twisted smile. The whispers rose into a cacophony, deafening in their intensity. "You cannot escape. The curse has already begun." Emeka stumbled backward, his heart racing as the room spun around him. His vision blurred. He couldn't breathe. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room fell into an unsettling silence. The faces were gone. Adana was gone. Only the photograph remained, lying on the floor in front of him, its image once again still and innocent, but not for long. If this story left you feeling uneasy and craving more answers, don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share your theories. What do you think is going on with Emeka's family? What is the connection between Adana and Neoma? The phone rang again. 3:17 a.m. Emeka's breath itched as he stared at the glowing screen. The same number. The same feeling of cold dread wrapping around his ribs like a serpent. He hesitated, his fingers trembling over the screen before swiping to answer. "Mama." His voice barely rose above a whisper. This time, her voice was clearer. Hollow. Strained. Not quite right. "She took my life, Emeka, now she's taking yours." The room contracted, suffocating him in a grip colder than the night air. His pulse drummed against his skull. He clutched the phone tighter. "Mama, what are you?" Neoma never died. She came back, as Adana. The line went dead. Silence pressed in. A dense, unnatural silence, the kind that devoured sound instead of allowing it to settle. Even the nocturnal hum of Lagos, the distant horns, the murmuring breeze, the occasional barking dog, had ceased. Emeka's hands shook. His mother had been dead for 5 years. But there was no mistaking her voice, or the sheer despair bleeding from her words. Was his wife really his dead aunt? And if so, what did she want with him? A slow creak echoed from the hallway. His skin prickled. He turned his head sharply toward the bedroom door, now slightly ajar. He was sure he had closed it before going to bed. He remembered locking it. A shadow moved beyond the door. His breath turned to ice in his throat. "Adana," he called out hesitantly. No response. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs as he stepped out of bed, each footstep hesitant on the cold tiles. The hallway stretched before him like an unending abyss. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on him like invisible hands. Then he heard it. A whisper. Faint. Fragile. But unmistakable. His name. Imikikea. It came from the living room. Slow. Drawn out. A voice that was both familiar and utterly foreign, laced with something inhuman. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His fingers brushed the switch on the wall. The light flickered but did not turn on. The darkness around him thickened, moving like a living thing. A shape stood by the window. Still. Watching. The dim glow from the streetlights outside barely outlined the figure. A woman. Dressed in a white wrapper. Barefoot. Her long, jet-black hair cascaded down her back in wet strands, dripping onto the floor. The air reeked of damp earth, decay, and something metallic, blood. Adana, he tried again, though he already knew it wasn't really her. The figure turned. The face that met him was not his wife's. It was Neoma's. Or at least, what was left of it. Her once beautiful features were twisted, sunken as black as a starless void. Her lips, dry and cracked, curled into something that might have been a smile once. But now, it was something monstrous. Something wrong. I waited, Emeka, she whispered, stepping closer. I waited in the dark for so long. His legs refused to move. His breath caught in his throat as she reached out a hand, her fingers too long, her nails yellowed and curling like claws. Come back to me, she murmured. You were always mine. A sudden, suffocating pressure wrapped around his chest. The air turned frigid. A voice, his mother's voice, screamed inside his head. Run. With every ounce of strength he had, Emeka staggered back, his foot catching on the rug. He crashed to the floor, scrambling backward like a desperate animal. His fingers fumbled against the side table. Something heavy, a brass lamp, met his grip. Without thinking, he hurled it at the figure. The lamp passed right through her. And then she laughed. A sound that slithered into his bones, rattling his soul. A sound that did not belong in this world. He forced himself to his feet, lungs burning as he stumbled toward the front door. His fingers clawed at the locks, shaking, slipping. Behind him, the whisper grew louder, turning into something else, a chorus of voices, wailing, beckoning, hungry. Just as his fingers twisted the lock free, something grabbed his wrist. Cold. Wet. Rotten. The last thing he had before the darkness swallowed him whole was her voice, soft as a lover's whisper. You should never have answered the phone. What do you think really happened to Emeka? Do you believe in spirits that can come back for unfinished business? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share. Emeka's feet barely made a sound as they pressed against the worn-dirt path leading through the village. The shadows of the evening were creeping closer, casting an eerie stillness over the land. As he walked, his mind raced. The conversation with the woman who had once been his mother's neighbor was replaying in his head, her hushed, trembling words sinking deep into his bones. Neoma didn't die in that fire, she had said. She said it. She was always different. Violent. Afterward, she disappeared. But Ngozi never stopped looking for her. Emeka clenched his fist, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. His mother had spent years searching for Neoma, only to end up finding nothing but despair. But why, he had asked. The woman had leaned closer, as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Because Neoma swore she'd come back. And when she did, she'd take everything Ngozi loved. As Emeka stood at the entrance of his home, the dark sky hanging above like a heavy curtain, his thoughts spun wildly. His mother was long gone, but the fear and sorrow she had lived with still clung to him like a second skin. Had Neoma truly survived the fire? And if she had, what did her return mean? His blood ran cold as the pieces began to fall into place. Adana. His wife, the woman he loved. She was the one thing he held dear, the only family he had left. Could it be true? Was Neoma really back to claim her vengeance? Inside, the house felt unnaturally quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He stepped into the dimly lit living room, where Adana sat by the window, her eyes gazing out into the distance. The orange glow of the setting sun bathed her in a warm light, but something in her expression was off. Emeka, she whispered, not turning to look at him. Do you believe in ghosts? A chill ran down his spine, and for a moment, he was unsure how to respond. His mind raced with the implications of her question. Could she already know about the connection between her and Neoma? You've been distant, she said softly, her voice barely above a murmur. Ever since that night, I felt something strange. Like something is watching me. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that it was just his paranoia, that everything was fine. But he couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were on the brink of something terrible. Adana, Emeka began, his voice thick with fear. I think we need to leave here. Something's coming. Before she could respond, a loud knock echoed from the door, cutting through the stillness. The sudden noise sent a jolt of panic through Emeka's chest. He moved cautiously toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. As he reached for the handle, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting on the other side would change everything. Opening the door, he was greeted by a figure cloaked in shadow. The person stepped forward, their face hidden beneath a dark hood. Who are you? Emeka demanded, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound commanding. The stranger stepped closer, revealing a pair of piercing, unnatural eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. You already know, the stranger's voice rasped. Neoma lives. Emeka stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Adana's voice broke through the fog of his shock, a frantic whisper as she appeared at his side. What does that mean? Who are you? What do you want with us? The stranger tilted their head, as if considering her question. You've been marked. All of you. And now, you will pay for what was done. The words hung in the air like a curse, heavy and suffocating. Emeka could hardly breathe as the weight of the stranger's words pressed down on him. Who are you? Emeka demanded again, his voice growing more desperate. The stranger stepped forward, and for a moment, the air seemed to grow colder. The faint scent of smoke, of fire and ash, filled the room. My name is Olamide, the figure said, their voice now a deep, haunting tone. I am the one who was born from the ashes of your mother's sins. And I will not stop until the blood of her loved ones is spilled. Adana gasped, her hand gripping Emeka's arm for support as the words struck her like a blow. What do you want from us? Olumide's lips curled into a sinister smile. Neoma never died. She was only waiting for the right moment. And now, the moment has come. Emeka could feel the room growing colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in. There was something unnatural about the air around them, something ancient and full of malice. The fire that had consumed Neoma years ago was not just a physical event, it had marked her soul, twisted it, and now it was back to claim its due. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension, calm but authoritative. Leave them alone, Olamide. From the shadows of the doorway stepped a tall, imposing figure. Emeka's heart skipped a beat as the man's features came into view. His tall frame was draped in a flowing black agbada, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, burning with intensity. Elder Okeke. Emeka breathed. The elder gave a slight nod, his gaze never leaving Olamide. You cannot hide in the shadows of the past. Your mother's sins will not define this family. Olamide snarled, but his figure seemed to flicker, as if part of him was struggling to remain in this world. You cannot stop me, Elder, Olamide hissed. This family is cursed. Their blood will be mine. Elder Okeke stepped forward, his presence commanding, his eyes glimmering with power. Then it is time we put an end to this curse. As if in response, the air around them crackled with energy. The temperature dropped even further, and the flickering candle flames in the room began to waver and dance unnaturally. Olumide's form shimmered, and for a split second, Emeka thought he saw a glimpse of a terrifying, monstrous face beneath the hood. Before Emeka could react, Olumide lunged, but Elder Okeke raised his hand, and a wave of energy blasted through the room. The force sent Olumide crashing against the wall, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Adana's breath hitched, her eyes wide with fear. What is happening? Your mother's bloodline is strong, Elder Okeke said, his voice steady. But so is the power of those who protect it. Emeka turned to face him, confusion clouding his mind. What do we do now? How do we stop this? Elder Okeke stepped toward them, his eyes full of grim determination. There is a ritual. One that must be performed before the next full moon. It will seal away the evil that has been awakened. And what happens if we don't perform it? Emeka asked, dread pulling in his stomach. The curse will consume you all, Elder Okeke said softly. And Nneoma's revenge will be complete. The room felt like it was closing in on Emeka. His thoughts raced as he struggled to comprehend the gravity of their situation. How could he protect Adana, his family, when they were being haunted by something beyond comprehension? And what had his mother truly known about the darkness that lay hidden in the fire? He could feel the weight of his ancestors' eyes upon him now. The spirits of the past were watching, waiting. And in the distance, the fire that never went out was waiting to burn them all. Will Emeka and Adana be able to stop the curse? What role does Elder Okeke play in this dark mystery? If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Who do you think Olumide really is? And can Emeka and Adana escape the vengeance that's coming? I'd love to hear your theories. The final call came. Emeka, she's not just my sister. A pause. The words seemed caught in a web of hesitation, tangled between truth and danger. What do you mean? Emeka's voice was low, cautious. On the other end of the line, there was static, a hesitant breath. She's also. A knock at the door. Sharp. Deliberate. Emeka's body tensed. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He glanced at his phone, the call still active, but then it ended. The silence was deafening. Adana's voice, sweet as poison, drifted through the wood. Emeka. Who are you talking to? He turned to the door, swallowing the tension in his throat. He could still hear the lingering echo of the voice on the call, filled with urgency, almost pleading. He slipped the phone into his pocket, inhaled deeply, then pulled the door open. Adana stood there, bathed in the dim glow of the hallway light, her lips curled into something between a smile and a warning. Her eyes scanned his face, sharp and knowing. You look uneasy, she observed. Bad news. Emeka forced a casual chuckle. Just work. Nothing serious. Adana tilted her head. Work. At this hour. Her tone was light, teasing, but something lurked beneath the surface. A curiosity that felt more like a threat. Emeka stepped aside, letting her in. His mind raced. Who was she really? And why did her presence always feel like a game of chess where he never knew if he was winning or already checkmated? She walked in with the confidence of someone who owned the space. Her gold earrings gleamed in the faint light, swaying as she moved. She let her fingers trail along the back of his chair before turning to him. You're sweating, Emeka. It's warm, he lied. She chuckled. Is it? Or is it because of the call? His fingers curled into a fist at his side. What call? Her smile didn't waver. Exactly. What call? Silence wrapped around them, thick and suffocating. Then another knock. This one, firmer. More urgent. Adana's eyes flickered to the door, expecting someone else. Emeka's pulse quickened. He stepped toward the door, but before he could reach it, Adana grabbed his wrist. Her grip was strong, surprising. "Wait. Let me." Her voice was silky but firm. Emeka hesitated. The knock came again. Adana turned the knob, and the door swung open. A man stood in the doorway. Tall. Lean. Eyes sharp like broken glass. Emeka recognized him instantly. Uzodinma. A name that sent ripples through the underbelly of the city. A man whose presence meant one of two things: trouble or death. Adana's grip on Emeka's wrist tightened. Surprised, she murmured. Uzodinma's lips curved. "It's been a while, hasn't it, Emeka?" The air in the room shifted. Darkened. Adana stepped aside, allowing Uzodinma to enter, his step slow, deliberate. "I hear you've been asking questions. Making calls." Emeka forced himself to remain steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Uzodinma laughed a low, dangerous sound. "Of course, you don't. That's why I'm here. To help you, remember." Adana shut the door. The click of the lock was final. The game had just begun. Adana stood there, her lips curling into a smile that did not reach her eyes. But her eyes, they weren't human. They were hollow. Deep. Something ancient stirred behind them, something watching, waiting. Emeka's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to reach for something, anything to ground himself in reality. But reality was shifting beneath his feet. "You weren't supposed to find out," Adana said softly, tilting her head. "Yonioma," Emeka breathed, his voice barely a whisper. She laughed, and the sound was wrong. Too many voices. A chorus of something broken. "Yes," she admitted. "But that's not the real secret." She stepped closer, her bare feet soundless against the wooden floor. The air around her thickened, pressing in on Emeka like a living thing. "The real secret is, you were never real, Emeka." The words hit him like a hammer to the chest. The room swayed, his vision tunneling. His mind rebelled, grasping at memories his childhood, his mother's voice, the smell of rain in the village square. They were real. They had to be. Uzodinma moved then, a blur of motion in the corner of his eye. "Enough of this madness," he growled, stepping between Emeka and Adana Nyoma, whatever she was. His presence was solid, unwavering, like a fortress against the unraveling chaos. "Stay out of this, Uzodinma," Adana warned, her voice rippling like water over stone. "Not a chance," he shot back. "You think you can break him? Twist his mind. Not while I breathe." She sighed, as if disappointed. "You always were stubborn." Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating her face in sharp relief. For a fraction of a second, Emeka saw beyond the illusion. The smooth, human skin flickered, revealing something else beneath. Something with too many eyes, too many mouths. A scream built in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "Not now. Not yet." "Emeka, focus," Uzodinma said, his voice steady, grounding. "She's trying to get into your head. But you know the truth. You are real. She's the lie." Adana's face darkened, her smile gone. "You shouldn't have said that." The temperature in the room plummeted. The walls shuddered. The air crackled with something unseen, something angry. Uzodinma didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed Emeka's arm, squeezing hard. "We end this. Now." Emeka looked at him, something clicking into place. together. Adana no, Neoma let out a shriek that wasn't meant for human ears. The wall splintered. The floor cracked beneath their feet. And then, the door burst open. Darkness rushed in like a tidal wave. What do you think will happen next? Will Emeka and Uzodimma survive this confrontation? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're loving the suspense, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Darkness rushed in like a tidal wave, swallowing the room whole. The air grew thick, as though every breath was a struggle, heavy with secrets left unspoken for far too long. The chill of the unknown crept into Emeka's bones, and the shadows seemed to stretch, consuming everything in their path. Adana, no, Neoma, was standing there, her figure barely visible against the abyss that had suddenly descended upon them. Her eyes, cold and unfeeling, locked onto Emeka's. There was no recognition, no warmth. Only a chilling emptiness. Emeka's heart pounded in his chest. What is happening? He thought, his mind racing. The last time he had seen Neoma, no, Adana, she had been a stranger. Or was she? The question spiraled, all leading to one burning truth: something was horribly wrong. Stop. Uzodimma's voice cut through the blackness, his silhouette appearing in the doorway. His face was drawn tight with tension, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. But it was too late. Adana, or Neoma, as she now claimed, raised her hand. Suddenly, a flicker of light illuminated her features, and in that moment, Emeka could see the deep sorrow etched in her eyes. There was a quiet despair, something that tugged at his very soul, threatening to tear him apart. You don't understand, Neoma whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. None of you do. Emeka's breath caught. He wanted to speak, wanted to demand answers, but the weight of her words had a paralyzing effect on him. Neoma's fingers trembled as she pulled out an old, crumpled newspaper from her bag. The edges were worn, the ink faded, but the headline was unmistakable. Ngozi's son died in childbirth. Emeka's stomach lurched. His world tilted. No, he breathed. This can't be true. Neoma's lips curled into a bitter smile, her eyes never leaving him. She was broken, Emeka. So broken. She couldn't bear it. She pretended you were alive, that you hadn't really died. That's why she clung to the past, because without you, she was nothing. Emeka felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His body went cold, a numbness seeping into his veins. No. That's not possible. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. This isn't real. But the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, he could feel it. The memories, the dreams that had plagued him, the whispers in the dark. All the signs had been there, but he had refused to see them. It wasn't enough, Emeka, Neoma continued, her voice rising in volume, her anger now palpable. You died, and she couldn't let go. When I returned, I played along, just like she asked. I pretended to be the woman she wanted me to be. But now? Her voice cracked, her hands shaking violently as she clenched the old newspaper tighter. Emeka stumbled back, as though physically struck. His heart ached as he grappled with the words she had just spoken. The woman he had known, the woman he thought loved him, had lost him. And now, it seemed, he was nothing more than a figment of her broken mind. No, this is impossible, he repeated, almost desperately. Neoma's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, and for a split second, Emeka thought he saw a glimpse of the woman he once knew. But then the moment passed, and she took a step closer, her expression hardening once more. You're just a ghost, Emeka. A memory that refuses to die. Her words cut deeper than any blade could. And now, it's time to let go. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse, alive and breathing. The air crackled with an energy that felt as though it could collapse everything around them at any moment. Emeka's chest tightened, as though an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. His body was shaking, his thoughts scrambled, but there was one thing that stood out: he couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let go of everything he had fought for, everything he believed in. With trembling hands, he reached out to her. "Neoma, don't." His voice was raw, desperate. "Please, we can fix this. We can find a way to make this right." But Neoma simply smiled, a sad, haunting smile, and reached toward him, her hand like a shadow, cold and unfeeling. "No, Emeka. It's over." The world around him began to blur, the edges of reality warping. It felt as though everything was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. "Let go, Emeka," Neoma whispered once more, her voice like a soft lullaby that promised peace but only brought terror. Suddenly, everything went black. The world went still. Emeka's mind raced, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. What had just happened? Was he dead? Was this the end? He didn't know. But one thing was certain: he was trapped in this nightmare, and he couldn't escape. Not without the truth. The silence pressed in, suffocating him. Every part of him screamed for answers, screamed for someone to pull him out of this abyss. But as the darkness closed in, he realized that the answers weren't outside of him. They were within. What do you think will happen next, dear viewers? Will Emeka find the strength to confront the truth and break free from the shadows? Or will he remain trapped in the memory of what once was? What would you do if you were in his shoes? The suspense lingered in the air, thick and palpable. Don't forget to like this video if you're as curious as we are about what happens next, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think Emeka should do? What do you think Neoma's true motives are? It was a quiet evening when the Thompson family moved into their new home, a charming house nestled on the outskirts of the city, with old brick walls and towering oak trees lining the driveway. The house had been vacant for years, its previous owners having moved out after some unsettling rumors had started circulating in the neighborhood. But the Thompsons were unaware of the whispers. To them, the house was a perfect fit, a fresh start after a series of life changes. The house had an inviting charm to it, but it also carried a certain mystery. The attic was filled with relics of the past, remnants of Emeka's time there before he had left the city. Mrs. Thompson, curious about the old treasures hidden away in the dusty corners of the attic, ventured up with a flashlight in hand. Her husband, Mark, was busy in the yard, and their children were already playing in the garden. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to explore. As Mrs. Thompson rummaged through the forgotten boxes, she noticed something strange tucked beneath a pile of old blankets: a phone. It was an outdated model, one that looked like it hadn't seen use in years. She dusted it off, intrigued by its unusual appearance. "Mark will probably want to toss this," she muttered to herself, but the phone caught her attention. The screen flickered to life as if responding to her touch, showing an unfamiliar wallpaper of an old, weathered oak tree, almost too familiar to the trees outside the window. She pressed the home button, but the phone remained locked. Strange. The battery was almost dead. Just as she was about to put it down, the screen flickered again, and a strange message appeared. "Incoming call, unknown." Curiosity piqued, Mrs. Thompson, with a cautious breath, answered the call. The voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "Don't trust her, she's not who she says she is." The voice was distorted, strained, as though the man speaking was in desperate need of help. His words sent an unsettling ripple through her, and she instinctively recoiled. Who was this? What did he mean by she? Mrs. Thompson's hand trembled as she gripped the phone, unsure of what to do. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Suddenly, the phone slipped from her hand, falling to the attic floor with a muffled thud. Her breath caught in her throat. The room felt colder. The air seemed thicker. She slowly looked up, her eyes scanning the attic's shadows. In the mirror hanging on the far wall, something shifted. A figure, dark, ethereal, moved behind her. It wasn't a reflection of her own. The shadow seemed almost alive, shifting and riding as if it had a mind of its own. She gasped, her voice caught in her throat, as she turned to look over her shoulder. The attic was empty. The figure was gone. Her heart raced. Could it be that the house was playing tricks on her? Maybe it was the isolation, the strange noises settling into her mind. She turned back to the mirror, but the reflection remained still, too still. The phone lay on the floor, the screen now blank, its eerie call a memory that felt too real. Her pulse stuttered in her ears. What had she just heard? Who was that man? And what had he meant about her? Before she could process anything further, the hairs on her neck stood on end. Something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Thompson rushed downstairs, nearly stumbling in her haste, the phone forgotten in the attic. She found Mark in the living room, sitting with a cup of coffee. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and he immediately noticed the change in her demeanor. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing with concern. He could tell something had shaken her. I don't know," she stammered, trying to steady her breath. "I found something in the attic. A phone. It rang. Someone spoke to me." Mark raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "What do you mean, someone spoke to you?" Mrs. Thompson swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "A man." His voice was desperate. He said, "Don't trust her, she's not who she says she is." Mark gave a half laugh, trying to ease the tension. "It's probably just some prank. It's an old phone, right? Maybe some random person's number showed up. Nothing to worry about." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't convinced. There was something deeply unsettling about the entire experience. She needed to know more. "What do you think? Do you believe that the voice on the phone was a warning, or just a strange coincidence? Could there be something hidden in this house that Mrs. Thompson needs to discover? Let us know in the comments below." As night fell, the Thompsons settled into their new life. The house, though full of history and mystery, seemed peaceful on the surface. The family gathered for dinner, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. There was something lurking in the house. Later that night, Mrs. Thompson couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the voice in her head, the warning that didn't make sense. Who was the her he was referring to? Was it someone in the house? Someone in her family? She couldn't rest. Something was pulling her back up to the attic, where the phone lay. Her mind raced as she reached the door to the attic. The stairs creaked underfoot, the house groaning with age. The air grew heavier, the shadows stretching out in odd shapes. She stepped into the attic, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The phone was still there, lying on the floor as if waiting for her. But as she reached for it, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come back." Mrs. Thompson froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was cold, familiar, but she couldn't place it. Turning slowly, she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, an older woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her face obscured by shadows. The woman's eyes were wide, her expression one of deep sorrow. Mrs. Thompson backed away, but the woman's voice continued, echoing in the air around her. You don't know what you've done. You've brought her back. She's here. The air felt thick with tension as Mrs. Thompson tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her heart pounded against her chest. Who was this woman? And who was she? The attic door slammed shut with a force that sent her stumbling backward. The shadow in the corner began to move again, this time, much faster, more erratic. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't a person at all. It was a dark figure, shifting between the walls like smoke, slithering toward her. Just as the figure reached her, the attic light flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. What do you think? Who is the mysterious figure in the attic? And what's the connection to the old phone? Is this just a creepy coincidence, or is there something more sinister at play? Some truths are better left buried. The past always comes back sometimes, wearing the face of someone you love. And with that, the end. What do you think will happen next? Do you believe the mysterious woman is connected to the strange events happening? Drop your comments, and don't forget to hit the like button if you want to see more of this spine-chilling series. 20 comments to type part 2.